Hello and welcome to our presentation. We will be discussing the impact of COVID-19 misinformation spread over social media. We will look at three aspects of this. First, the influence of celebrities, then emerging fake authorities, and finally, statistics, consequences, and their solutions. Social media gives laymen the power to communicate their opinion to the masses, anonymously. Anyone can claim to be an expert with no motivation for self-censorship, as the repercussions are not seen or felt as they would be in real life.
I'm also going to talk about how social media gives celebrities and influencers a platform to share their views, which may be harmful to millions or even billions of users online. Ethically, this is a nightmare for consequentialists, as it allows for a small action to have an impact on so many lives. I'm mainly going to focus on the negative effects of mass communication, although there are, of course, benefits that can come out of such large online communities. Andrew Tate is an influencer who received criticism for sharing his opinions, sparking controversy online. These included some extremely misogynistic comments. Due to his massive online following, there is no doubt that he is capable of radicalizing teenagers and young men with his views, acting as a role model. Going back to the topic of COVID-19, he said in a clip the following quote: "This is blatantly advising against government protocols and dismissing the threat of the disease." This simple quote, which was shared hundreds of times on TikTok, is extremely dangerous, and its influence could cost vulnerable people their lives.
Now we will look more closely at celebrities spreading misinformation about COVID specifically. Novak Djokovic has a huge number of loyal fans due to his successful sporting career. This gives him a powerful platform on which to spread his message of vaccine freedom, whereby he has caused many to forego COVID vaccines, believing that mandatory vaccination is a violation of their fundamental human rights and freedoms. Jair Bolsonaro was the president of Brazil during the pandemic, and he believed that the dangers of COVID were negligible. As such, he obstructed key restrictions and regulations, as well as delaying the sourcing of vaccines. This resulted in huge numbers of unnecessary deaths. He also propagated misinformation, such as encouraging the use of hydroxychloroquine as a treatment. Donald Trump wields great political power. His supporters are dedicated and believe almost everything he says. He has publicly shared his anti-vax sentiments in the past, such as this tweet from March 2014, in which he clearly makes an untrue claim. He also promoted ineffective treatments for COVID, such as malaria medicines and disinfectants, with no scientific evidence for support. Most dangerously, online news sites that support his political views echoed these messages, exposing those who didn't know any better to the harmful misinformation on how to cope with the pandemic. Cornell University carried out a study of 38 million online articles, all related to the pandemic. Donald Trump featured in almost 38% of those related to misinformation, making him the single largest driver of COVID misinformation. He also spoke extensively on the merits of hydroxychloroquine as a treatment, while having no legitimate scientific backing.
A malicious example of COVID-19 misinformation through social media is the distribution of illegal resources. In the case of Jasmine Clifford, she sold fake vaccine cards and conspired with a New York nurse to enter at least 10 unvaccinated people into New York's immunization database. In other cases, in an extreme case, MHRA was forced to crack down on 9 scammers who were operating through various social media sites, selling things from fake COVID test kits to antiviral misting sprays. Now, in these cases, it's fairly cut and dry to most ethical bases that banning these bad faith actors is the right decision. And in fact, not banning these scammers has clear harmful consequence for users. Now, given that banning them by hand could face volume limitations, using machine learning algorithms to root out these undesirable users is a very viable option. Now, in a less, clear example, Jay Bhattacharya is a professor of medicine and economics at Stanford University. Now, he's very qualified. He has an MD, along with a PhD in economics. However, when the COVID pandemic broke out, Bhattacharya was adamantly against kind of governmental response to the pandemic. Through social media, he kind of voiced his distaste for lockdowns or imposing mask mandates, and thus he is a very controversial figure. And in fact, his reverence for opposing lockdowns led him to being shadow banned on Twitter, which drastically decreases kind of the volume of his social media voice. Now, the question is this ethical? And even if you buy the premise that Bhattacharya is causing more harm than good, it's suddenly more ethically unclear whether the means of banning him are justified by the benefits of him being off of the platform. Now, a consequentialist might say that banning him results in a net positive, and so he should be banned off the platform. But a deontologist whose rule set might say that censorship is not allowed might think that banning Bhattacharya is unethical. Now, there is an interesting consideration in that social media is fundamentally censorship. Now, by choosing to show your post to a certain number of people, social media is also choosing not to show your post, at its core, to a certain number of people as well. And so if you're a deontologist who thinks that censorship is not allowed, then you might have to have a problem with social media as a whole.
Ryan and I are now going to take over, and we'll be talking about misleading statistics, their consequences, and afterwards we'll all be talking about solutions to the problems that we've just talked about. According to a study by the Reuters Institute, most COVID-related misinformation, about 59% of it, consisted of various forms of reconfiguration of existing and true information by recontextualizing it, and this resulted in false statistics. Furthermore, these reconfigurations of information accounted for 89% of misinformed social media interactions, which really highlights the vast influence that misinterpreted statistics had on COVID awareness, as you can see in the figure on the slide. When it comes to the ethical issues with misinformation of this kind, one of the major problems is that incorrect information can be generated appealing to many different ideologies. And with the basis of this wrong information in true facts, it makes it more difficult to debunk easily or quickly, making the information very believable. Psychologically, ideology plays a key role in a person's decision making and, in this situation, more importantly, their skepticism. A dramatic example of this is the following. As you can see on the slide, a study found that 82% of vaccinated people were in support of tougher sanctions on Russia over the situation in Ukraine, while 75% of unvaccinated people were against these tougher sanctions. Although these aren't causally related, and this is only correlation, it does highlight how vast the role of ideology is when it comes to beliefs and skepticism. With this in mind, the availability of a wide range of such incorrect and reconfigured information, further amplified by the widespread access to social media, almost ensures that people of all different ideologies will come across information that tailors to their skepticism, encouraging them to believe it regardless of the truth in it. And once this misinformation is part of their ideology and part of their belief, it is very difficult to change their mind. This is ethically wrong, as people are misled into incorrect beliefs that may affect their lifestyles, quite possibly in a detrimental way health-wise. In more extreme cases, it shaped health policy, increased stigma and discrimination, and quite possibly caused deaths as a result. I'll now be handing over to Ryan.
Thank you, Rishabh. So I'm now here to showcase some examples of misleading statistics that's been shared on social media over the pandemic. So here's a claim made in Joe Rogan Experience podcast on YouTube, claiming that over 70% of COVID-19 deaths are now in the vaccinated people in the UK, implying that you're more likely to die of COVID-19 if you get vaccinated against it. Well, statistically speaking, it reflects the true fact that over 70% of people who died of COVID-19 in the UK are vaccinated. This is reported in its Week 38 Vaccine Surveillance Report, UK HSA data. However, this larger proportion of death is expected, since the vaccinated group is already taking up most of the UK population. In fact, based on rough calculations using data published by Johns Hopkins University, 0.2% of the vaccinated people died of COVID-19, in contrast to the 0.5% death rate of the unvaccinated population in the UK since the start of the pandemic. The second example is that it's a random tweet that's been forwarded more than 10 million times, and it claims that only 17,000 people have died from COVID-19 in the UK, implying that COVID is not that dangerous. We do not have to be careful. Well, COVID-19 actually initiated a chain of events that ultimately leads to the death of more than 140,000 individuals. This is deaths involving COVID or COVID as an underlying cause of death. There is a huge range of pre-existing conditions that can be listed on the death certificate, such as heart disease and cancers. COVID-19 simply pulls the trigger to initiate these conditions. Now that we've talked about how and what kind of misinformation that has been shared on social media platforms, let's look at some consequences as a result of sharing these kinds of misinformation. Reports in Chinese Medical Social Journal shows that after the spread of misinformation of COVID-19 vaccinations categorized as aggressive and misleading, vaccine acceptability has dropped from over 70% in March 2020 to less than 50% in October 2020 in major cities in mainland China. In addition, after Donald Trump's reckless advertisement of the internal usage of hydroxychloroquine to prevent or cure COVID-19, the CDC, or known as Centers for Disease Control, reported a steep increase in calls to poison centers regarding exposure to household disinfectants. Having conducted a survey in the United States, the CDC found that 39% of the households surveyed reported some extent of engaging in dangerous practices, including washing food products with bleach, applying household cleaners directly to skin, and intentionally inhaling or ingesting disinfectants with the goal of preventing COVID-19 infection. As you can see, the consequences of spreading misleading data is detrimental and highly unethical. So what measures can we take to tackle the issues caused by misinformation spread? I'll leave this to my colleagues to discuss.
Our first solution is a white box filtering algorithm. Now, if there's a way to classify misinformation as what it is, then it should never reach a user's feed. Now, neglecting to do so has clear harmful effects, as the case studies we've observed show. Now, importantly, putting censorship in the hands of a computer has clear ethical problems. And so all of the factors behind a decision that a filtering algorithm ultimately makes need to be examinable, i.e. the machine learning algorithm that you decide to implement will need to be white box.
Another possible solution involves using a third-party fact checker. This involves using existing data from verified sources to check whether or not information being shared is actually factual. The algorithm used by Facebook doesn't actually remove any content, it just reduces the relevance so that fewer people see it. However, there are some drawbacks. Due to the amount of data being uploaded by users, the process of fact-checking is long and labor-intensive. Also, since the censorship is ultimately decided by humans, there is a risk that bias is introduced.
The solution I propose is government effort for awareness. Now, what I mean by that is that the government should take a concerted effort in increasing the amount of correct and accurate information that can be found on social media through perhaps its own posts. Now, this bypasses the ethical issue of placing a person's voice in the hands of a computer, which is good. Now, of course, there are several issues. For one, the scope is potentially limited because a government might not be properly funded, or they might not be kind of taking this initiative seriously. Now, it's also an issue that this kind of approach could become increasingly difficult as social media volume increases, and then thus your voice doesn't reach kind of as large of a percentage of the population as it did before.
And that was our group presentation on misinformation spread on social media of COVID-19. Thank you for listening to our presentation.